Okay, so this mini lecture is just going to talk about the issues of intelligence, our concepts of what intelligence is, and also how we go about measuring it. And there are different viewpoints out there that were covered somewhat in your book, and I just wanted to go into a bit more detail about this topic. Okay, so in addition to what is changing in cognitive development in general, something that becomes of increasing importance in middle childhood is understanding individual differences in mental development. And the biggest area of study that addresses individual differences is the study of intelligence. And during middle childhood, intelligence tests do actually become important in assessing these individual differences in mental development. They're used quite regularly in the school system to either identify children who might need some sort of special education or to identify kids who might be qualified for something like gifted education. So they are used quite a bit. And if we're going to use tests in this way, i.e., to make decisions about children's educational opportunities, then we should understand something about the tests and whether or not they test what they're supposed to, right? So one of the issues is in how best to define intelligence and whether we can really capture or measure intelligence, especially in childhood. The most common definition of intelligence is falls under the rubric of general intelligence. That intelligence is something that we either have or don't have, that you are sort of generally intelligent or not, and this contributes to how well you perform on several different tasks. And so, if you're good in one area and you're highly intelligent, you're probably going to be good in another area. Some of the definitions of intelligence include things like reasoning ability and looking at several different mental capacities and how those um, are performed by the individual as a collection in assessing a general intelligence. Now, the types of intelligence tests that are used in schools and other settings test this notion of general intelligence, this thing that we either have or don't have, as opposed to focusing on maybe specific strengths or abilities that an individual child might have. Okay, so there are a couple things you should know. That based on these IQ tests or intelligence tests, um, there isn't a lot of stability in the scores of IQ tests for children until about age 6. Now, what's interesting about that is that children also start school, formal schooling in particular, at about that age, or have been in school, maybe formal schooling for about a year at about that age. And the other thing that we know is that IQ tests, your score on an IQ test is highly correlated with academic achievement. So you have to wonder, what is it that these tests are really measuring? Are they measuring actual intelligence, or are they measuring um, academic experience, right, and the effect that that experience has on your cognitive ability, etc. But this generally hasn't been addressed at the level of educational settings that typically, since IQ tests correlate well with school performance, they've been used as a way of making educational decisions for children. And it's not clear that intelligence tests should be used in this way. But that's just something to think about, to keep in the back of your mind, okay? Um, Now, there are a couple of different types of tests. There are group tests, and group tests allow testing of large groups all at one time. And the people who administer these tests typically don't need much training. It's typically used for instructional planning or to identify students who might be in need of individual testing. Where intelligence testing really started was with individual tests, and in these individual tests, examiners need training and experience, and they need to provide this experience. They need to use this experience to provide insights about the accuracy of the score, and that these tests are used to identify either highly intelligent children or children with learning difficulties. So, like I said, this is really where intelligence testing started, was with the individual tests. We've talked before briefly about how Binet was commissioned by the French government when educating children became a requirement, to develop a test that could help identify children who were not benefiting from a regular school curriculum. So the idea was that you would individually test children with administrators that were very well trained and understood these tests very well, and the goal was to help children. And when these tests came to the United States, that idea kind of got turned on its head. We tried to figure out ways to use the tests more efficiently, and that's when we started to devise these group tests so you could test lots of people at one time and didn't need someone who was well trained to administer the test. And we also sort of took the initial motivation, which was to help children, and use the test to make other kinds of decisions that included everything from keeping people from immigrating to the United States by administering group intelligence tests to immigrants at Ellis Island, even if they didn't speak English. And even in the United States, not too long ago, let's say in the 50s and 60s, IQ tests were being used in the school system with non-native English speaking children, and a lot of these children were classified as being mentally retarded and then relegated to special education, even though it was obviously inappropriate for them to have been tested in English. Okay, so these are just some little bits and pieces of the history of intelligence testing that I'm kind of throwing out there. We could actually spend a whole week or more just on intelligence by itself, but I'm just kind of giving you a little taste of that. Okay. Now, the two most widely used intelligence tests are the Stanford-Binet and also the WISC. The WISC 3 that's listed here is actually outdated. There are, I think, more recent versions even than that. And they're slightly different from one another. The Stanford-Binet can be used for individuals between the ages of 2 and adulthood. So there are versions, different versions, obviously, for those ages. And it measures 4 factors of intelligence, including verbal reasoning, which includes things like vocabulary, comprehension. It also measures quantitative reasoning, which includes things like arithmetic, abstract visual reasoning, which includes things like pattern analysis or block design, and short-term memory, which includes things like digit memory. And the WISC came about because Wechsler criticized the Stanford-Binet and suggested that the Stanford-Binet relied too heavily on verbal ability in order for individuals to perform well. So that even if you are being assessed on quantitative reasoning, you might, for instance, be given a word problem. And so you would have to be able to comprehend the problem verbally and also give your answer verbally. And so you're measuring more than arithmetic ability at that point. You're actually measuring verbal ability in addition to arithmetic ability. And so Wechsler tried to devise 2 broad intellectual factors, one that would be lumped under verbal performance and the other that would be lumped under performance and not verbal. Okay, so the verbal factor included things like comprehension and arithmetic and digit span and vocabulary, so that you had different things from the Stanford-Binet kind of lumped into that one category if they relied somehow on verbal ability in order to perform well. And then the performance factor focused on things where you didn't need to use verbal skills to answer the question. So picture completion or block design or picture arrangement would be examples of the kinds of items that you would see on the Wechsler Intelligence Performance Scale. So this just shows you some of the typical intelligence test items that fall under the categories that I was talking to you about. So under vocabulary, a child might be asked, tell me what the word carpet means. Under arithmetic, you see the word problem. If a $60 jacket is 25% off, how much does it cost? And then you see these more perceptual and spatial reasoning items that would fall under something like the Wechsler's performance scale. Block design, where you would be shown the block design on the left and given blocks with these color patterns on them and asked to make the blocks that you have look just like the picture. Or picture concepts, where you choose one object from each row to make a group of objects that goes together. Spatial visualization, and then you have typical working memory items like digit span, letter number sequencing, symbol search. So you have these things in your book, and you should take a closer look at them there. Okay, so there are other views in addition to the general intelligence and intelligence test viewpoints. Sternberg has one of these alternative definitions and views of intelligence, and he argues specifically that these intelligence tests can underestimate the intellectual strengths of some children because they don't really tap into enough of what we might consider intelligence or intelligent behavior. And so what he has done is tried to combine this intelligence test approach, also referred to as like factor analytic approach, with an information processing approach. So that the idea is that we need to identify the cognitive processes that underlie our performance on the various tasks that are part of these intelligence tests. And so he has this triarchic theory of intelligence where our intellectual behavior is made up of these three interrelated intelligences. So we have an analytical intelligence that basically makes up our information processing skills, right? So our ability to apply strategies, to engage in cognitive self-regulation, etc. And then we have creative intelligence, which is your ability to solve novel problems. So you encounter a problem that you've never seen before. How quickly are you able to adapt to that new problem and solve that problem? Do you have enough working memory capacity as a means of intelligence in order to work through that novel problem? And then the third component is practical intelligence, and this has to do with how you apply your intellectual skills in everyday situations. How well do you adapt to your environment, shape your environment, or select environments to meet both your personal goals and the demands of the everyday world? So it's a bit more of an in-depth look at what intelligence is, and it may in some ways be more palatable than a general intelligence or intelligence testing approach. Uh, the other side of this, though, is that if you want to use this to assess intelligence, then you might have some difficulty. Because how do you measure something like practical intelligence, for example? Is that something that we can actually measure reliably and validly? So that's something to consider as well. Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences is suggesting that we don't just have this one thing called general intelligence, that we have several different intelligences that are independent from one another. So Gardner believes that intelligence should be defined in terms of these distinct sets of processing operations that permit the individual to engage in a wide range of culturally valued activities. And he dismisses the idea that general intelligence exists, and that, again, like we possess these different separate intelligences. And he argues that each intelligence has a unique biological basis. Each intelligence has a distinct course of development and also a different expert or end state performance possibility. And the evidence that Gardner used for this theory is people that are brain damaged, that have cognitive limitations in the area that where the damage occurred, but are staying completely intact in terms of their cognitive functioning in other areas. And so for him, that indicates that these abilities are separate and independent. And he also used what are referred to as idiot savants. These are individuals that are extremely talented in a particular area but don't function well in other areas as evidence. And so he has these 8 different intelligences: linguistic, logical, mathematical, musical, spatial, bodily kinesthetic, naturalist, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. So some of these are things that you would see on a regular IQ test, like linguistic ability, perhaps, and logical and mathematical ability, but other things that you would never see on an IQ test, like bodily kinesthetic or interpersonal and intrapersonal skills. So you want to take a look at this a little bit longer on your own and see what you think. But one of the problems, again, is that it's hard to test this theory. It's hard to measure these different forms of intelligence, and it's hard to get evidence that suggests that they're actually independent of one another. What ends up happening when you try to operationalize these forms of intelligence and measure them is they end up being correlated with one another across individuals, and what that lends support to is a general intelligence view as opposed to a multiple intelligence view. So more work needs to be done in this area. Now, an area of intelligence research has looked at what has been found in terms of group differences in IQ. That there has been a lot of research that has consistently shown, for instance, that American black children score on the average about 12 to 13 IQ points below American white children. That gap has recently decreased a little bit because it used to be on average about 15 points. So now we're seeing it, instead of being 15 points, about 12 to 13 point difference. There are also consistent social class differences, with a gap between middle income and low income children of about 9 IQ points on the average. And so the question is, how do we explain these group differences? And there are different viewpoints on this. One viewpoint is that it is about nature, that it's about genetics. And Jensen was a proponent of this viewpoint and suggested that the differences that we see are because the groups that score lower are genetically inferior. And that's not a terribly old viewpoint, because in the early 90s, actually, a book called The Bell Curve came out, which proposed that same viewpoint. And so this is a viewpoint that is out there, that it's related to genetics. Um, if you look at other evidence, IQ scores of monozygotic twins are more similar than those of dizygotic twins. So that is suggesting, based on a behavioral genetics viewpoint, that some percentage of intelligence is related to genetics, since you have monozygotic twins being more similar than the dizygotic twins. Um, but something to remember is that just because heredity may be important, this does not mean that the environment is unimportant. Right? Just because heredity may have a factor to play does not mean that the environment can't do something to change it. Adoption studies, for instance, show that environment can improve on genetics. That even if you come from a biological family that scores typically lower on intelligence tests, if you're adopted into a setting that fosters intellectual growth, you can actually score significantly higher than your family of origin. So there are two views. One is that tests are not biased, that your ability to perform on intelligence tests represents how successful you are in the common culture. Okay, and so if you're not doing well on the IQ test, it's because you're not adapting well to the common culture. The other viewpoint in looking at these differences, these group differences, is that there are cultural factors out there that can hurt your performance on an IQ test. And there are some different areas that have been studied in relation to this. One has to do with communication styles and language customs that differ across different groups. That research suggests that ethnic minority subcultures often foster unique language skills that maybe don't fit the expectations of classrooms in the United States as well, or testing situations as well as other subcultures. So, one example is that if you look at American families, okay, and if you look at sort of the majority white American families, what these families tend to do in interacting with children verbally is they play what's called a quiz game. They are constantly asking children questions. They ask children questions even well before the child is able to speak. Okay? And the thing that's unique about these questions is that they are questions that the adult already knows the answer to. Okay, so the parent will say to her daughter, "Are those your shoes?" Right? And obviously, if the child is wearing those shoes, they're her shoes. But parents ask their children these questions all the time, and it's the quiz game. And if you think about what children will encounter when they get to a formal classroom setting, they will encounter the quiz game, right? Where the teacher, in most traditional academic settings, will stand in front of the classroom and ask questions of children that they themselves know the answer to. What is 2 plus 2? right? The children know that the teacher knows the answer to those questions. Well, what research has shown is that in some ethnic minority subcultures, for instance, in African American families, these parents ask children very different kinds of questions. They, instead of asking, these questions that they already know the answers to, they ask real questions. They ask questions that they do not know the answers to, like, what is that like, or how did that feel, where there's no single right answer. And this is also a very valuable type of questioning, but maybe it doesn't socialize children as well for what they get in the formal school setting. And so then perhaps they're confused by the types of questions that they're asked at school. So that's one theory, one suggestion out there. Another possibility is that children in these different subcultures, whether it's an ethnic subculture or you are from a lower social class, that you may not be as familiar with the test content as other children. That it could be that, for instance, low income children lack experience with the kinds of expensive games and objects that higher income children might have access to that could promote certain intellectual skills that would then help a child perform well on a particular aspect of an intelligence test, right? So if you don't have access to this kind of stuff in your everyday life, then that could put you at a disadvantage even before you get to that testing situation. And then the third possibility is the influence of stereotypes. That there is something studied that is called stereotype threat. And it's the fear of being judged that triggers anxiety that then interferes with your ability to perform well. So there's been lots of different studies done on this in lots of different ways. And one of the easiest examples is to look at the gender stereotype about math performance, right? So if you know what this gender stereotype is, females are not supposed to be as good at math as males are, and this is a stereotype that's really perpetuated in the educational setting, in the household, everywhere. Okay, and so what they do in these studies is they take two groups of males and females, and in one condition, the males and females are told before they take a math test that this math test has been shown to be biased against females. Okay, and then in the other group, they are also given a math test, but they're not given that information about the test being biased. And what you find is that the females in the control group, who were not given any information about the math test being biased, outperform the females in the experimental group, in which they were told that the math test is biased against females. So essentially what happens is you're kind of primed with this stereotype that as female you're not good at math and you're probably not going to do well on this test, and that maybe triggers some anxiety or some other process that interferes with your performance on that. And so the idea is that maybe ethnic minority children or low income children come into a testing situation knowing that they're not expected to do well, and maybe that stereotype kind of is primed somehow in the testing situation, and that is what in fact is interfering with performance. So there could be several different possibilities here. Another possibility in terms of cultural influence, which is not listed here, is that children in different subcultures are socialized differently, perhaps because parents have different views of what an intelligent child is. Right? So for some parents, intelligence is being able to do well academically, but for other parents, intelligence may be being obedient, right? And so how you're socialized based on those kinds of cultural beliefs could then potentially influence how well you perform in a testing situation. So it's just important to keep these issues in mind.